All right, let's dive in. We're taking a deep dive today into one of America's biggest mysteries, the JFK assassination. You've sent over some really fascinating research articles and witness statements. Seems like you're particularly interested in those alternative theories, the ones that challenge the official narrative.
Yeah, the JFK assassination, it's like a rabbit hole you can just keep going down, isn't it?
Exactly. And today, we're going to try to explore those rabbit holes without getting totally lost in the maze. We're focusing on three key areas where the official story, well, it kind of seems to fall apart a little bit.
Yeah.
The Tippit assassination, the Zapruder film, and some pretty conflicting accounts about Lee Harvey Oswald's whereabouts leading up to November 22nd. What he was doing, where he was, it's all a bit murky.
Yeah, and each one of these areas, if you really start to look closely, raises some serious questions about what really happened.
So let's start with Officer J.D. Tippit. One of the articles you sent in, The Tippit Assassination and David Billen's Hearing Loss by Walt Brown, it really stood out. It hones in on the testimony of two witnesses, William Scoggins and Jeanette Davis, who were interviewed by Warren Commission counsel David Billen. And what's interesting is that their statements, if you just take them at face value, they suggest Tippit wasn't just like a random cop who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right. Brown really focuses on how both Scoggins and Davis, they both placed Tippit in that neighborhood pretty regularly. Scoggins had seen him around a lot, and Davis even thought that he lived in the area.
Yeah, exactly. So it makes you wonder, was Tippett's encounter with Oswald actually just a chance meeting, or was there something more to it? Brown's article, it kind of suggests that Tippett's death, it might have served a very specific purpose, drawing resources away from Dealey Plaza and giving the authorities a quick way to apprehend the suspect.
It definitely makes you think about the timeline of events in a different way, right? And it raises this really interesting question. What if Tippett's murder wasn't random at all, but a carefully planned part of everything that was happening that day?
It's a chilling thought, for sure. All right, let's move on to the Zapruder film. Another article from the fourth decade. This one's by Richard W. Burgess, and it tackles those claims that the film was tampered with to, hide details about JFK's head wound.
Yeah, and this debate, it often gets bogged down in all the technical details of film manipulation. So to really understand the arguments, you got to consider, how could someone even alter the film back then in 1963?
Right, so you're talking techniques like rotoscoping and optical printing. But Burgess, he makes this argument that messing with 8mm film, especially with the Zapruder film's grainy quality and those tiny little frames, it would have been incredibly difficult back then.
Yeah, he really emphasizes the challenges. Like, just imagine trying to fake the blur, the blur from the camera movement and President Kennedy moving. And then you'd have to make sure that any added wound, like a fake wound, moved perfectly with the head in every single frame. Keeping all that aligned, the registration, it would have been practically impossible.
Yeah, Burgess basically says creating a perfect fake back in 63, it would have been mission impossible.
Exactly. And while this Zapruder film, it's been scrutinized so much over the years, the technical arguments against tampering, they are pretty compelling.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of those inconsistencies surrounding Oswald's movements in the days and weeks leading up to the assassination. We've got a bunch of shorter pieces from the fourth decade that point to some real head-scratchers. One that really jumps out is this museum registration that appears to be signed by Oswald.
This registration, it's allegedly signed by Oswald in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, on July 26, 1963. And this directly contradicts the Warren Report's timeline, which puts him in Mobile, Alabama on that same date.
Yeah, that's a big discrepancy. And the author suggests that this might point to Oswald's involvement in something completely different, activities related to atomic espionage, maybe even an attempt to create like a Red Scare narrative around him.
It definitely throws a wrench in the established timeline, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And it suggests that maybe we need to rethink what we know about Oswald's actions before the assassination.
Another fascinating article, Coordinated Witnesses. It takes a closer look at the account given by Buell Wesley Frazier. He was a TSBD employee who supposedly encountered Oswald in the building. What's interesting is that Frazier's story, it seems to change over time.
Yeah, like his later claim about meeting 3 Negro boys hiding on the 5th floor during the assassination. He never mentioned that before.
Right. And that just adds another layer of complexity to this whole web of testimonies, doesn't it? Then there's this FBI report about Agent Robert Barrett's presence at Oswald's arrest.
Yeah, Barrett's report contradicts other accounts that say Oswald was shouting, kill all the sons of bitches during the arrest.
And his presence itself is weird, right? Why was an FBI agent already there when they arrested the suspect in the Tippit case? It suggests a level of FBI involvement that the official narrative doesn't really explain. These little discrepancies, they may seem small, but they raise huge questions about whether we can really trust the timeline and the testimonies we've been given.
It's like if they're getting these smaller details wrong, what else are they missing? Or maybe even, deliberately obscuring.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole case so fascinating and so frustrating. It feels like every time we uncover one piece of this puzzle, we end up with 10 more questions.
It's a real labyrinth, isn't it? Full of twists and turns.
Speaking of twists and turns, let's talk about the magic bullet theory, which has got to be one of the most hotly debated aspects of the entire JFK assassination. We've got this article here, The Secret of Commission Exhibit 399, and it takes a really unique approach to this piece of evidence.
Yeah, Millicent Craner, she's the author, and she kind of flips the script on the usual argument. So instead of asking, how could one bullet do so much damage, she's asking, why didn't it do more?
Hold on, walk me through that. How could a bullet not do enough damage?
Well, she really digs into the research done by this guy, Dr. John Nichols. He painstakingly recreated the shooting conditions, using the same kind of ammo and rifle that Oswald supposedly used. And his findings are pretty wild. He found that a bullet fired from a similar distance, it could blast through something like 47 inches of solid pine.
Whoa, that's more than the combined thickness of, Kennedy's neck, Connolly's torso, and his wrist. That's the path that Commission Exhibit 399, the so-called magic bullet, supposedly took.
Exactly. So logically, you'd think that bullet would just keep going right, straight through Connolly's leg.
That's what I'm thinking. But it didn't. So what's the explanation?
Well, John Latimer, he's a big defender of the Warren Commission, and he argues that the bullet slowed way down after it went through Kennedy's neck. It basically lost momentum before hitting Connolly.
Okay, but wouldn't a neck dense enough to slow a bullet down that much? Wouldn't that also cause the bullet to tumble? And if it tumbled, wouldn't there be a much bigger exit wound than what we see in the evidence?
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's a major point that Craner brings up. And she actually backs it up with testimony from Dr. Charles Baxter, the guy who examined Kennedy at Parkland. He described the throat wound as being small and clean, as if passing through a sheet of paper. So, who is it? Was Kennedy's neck super dense, like a thick piece of wood, or thin, like paper?
It doesn't add up. What if it was Connolly's body that slowed the bullet down?
Craner addresses that too. She brings up the testimony of Dr. Robert Shaw, the surgeon who operated on Connolly's wrist. He said the rib he removed was really spongy, meaning it wouldn't have slowed down a bullet much at all. Plus, Craner points out this big difference in how people describe the size of Connolly's back wound. Latimer, the guy defending the magic bullet, he uses a measurement of 3 centimeters to support his theory. But that's actually the size of the wound after surgery, not the original entry wound.
So he's basing his argument on evidence that's been, distorted.
It seems that way. The original wound, it was closer to 1.5 centimeters, and that throws a big wrench into Latimer's whole argument.
It's kind of scary how easy it is to manipulate evidence, make it fit a certain story.
It does raise some red flags, for sure.
Okay, let's look at Connolly's wrist wound specifically. Craner brings up this really interesting detail from the testimony of Dr. Charles Gregory, the guy who treated the wound.
Dr. Gregory, he believed that the wrist wound, based on what he saw, was caused by something irregular, maybe a bullet fragment. And get this, he thought it hit the wrist backward.
Wait, backward? That goes against the whole idea of a pristine bullet passing through Connolly after hitting Kennedy.
Exactly. It makes you question that whole magic bullet theory, doesn't it? One little detail like that can really unravel a carefully constructed narrative.
You mentioned earlier the possibility of the CIA being involved in the assassination. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, there's this theory that's been around for a while that suggests Kennedy's decision to scale back Operation Mongoose, the covert operation to overthrow Castro in Cuba, that it really pissed off certain factions within the CIA.
So some people in the CIA felt like Kennedy betrayed them.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And this perceived betrayal, some researchers believe it could have motivated those factions to get rid of Kennedy.
That's a pretty dark thought. You also mentioned Edwin Lansdale. He was a key figure in covert operations. What's his connection to all of this?
Lansdale was known for being, pretty unorthodox. He had a lot of expertise in psychological warfare, and he was heavily involved in the early stages of Operation Mongoose. He was a big believer in using propaganda and deception to achieve political goals.
Do you think it's possible his skills were somehow used in a plot against Kennedy?
It's definitely a possibility. The full extent of Lansdale's involvement, it's still kind of a mystery, but his background and his expertise definitely make him a person of interest.
Let's switch gears a bit and talk about the Louisiana Un-American Activities Committee, or LUAC. Hugh Murray's article, it painted a pretty intense picture of their activities.
Yeah, he really emphasizes the climate of extreme paranoia and anti-communism that was all over Louisiana in the 50s and 60s. LUAC, they were at the forefront of investigating and disrupting anything that even looked like communist activity, and they often worked hand in hand with federal agencies like the FBI.
And their connection to Guy Bannister, the former FBI agent who supposedly had ties to Oswald, that's a big red flag.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what they knew about Oswald and what he was up to.
Right. And there's some evidence that suggests a deeper connection between Bannister and LUAC than they ever publicly admitted to. There's this letter from a guy named J.P. Shinley, and it includes a 1960 article that actually documents Bannister applying to work for LUAC.
So were LUAC's methods always, like, by the book?
Yeah.
Legal?
Well, there's this one case that Murray talks about that shows they were willing to push the boundaries, to say the least. In 1963, they raided the offices of the civil rights group, the Southern Conference Educational Fund. They took all their files, and then they secretly transferred those files to the U.S. Senate Internal Security Committee. And they did all of this, even though a judge had ordered them to return the files.
They basically ignored a direct order from a judge.
They did. And this incident, it shows how willing they were to operate outside of the legal system and also how closely they work with federal agencies. It suggests that there could have been this network of collaboration, a network that might have even extended to the events surrounding Kennedy's assassination.
It's kind of disturbing to think about these powerful groups operating in secrecy and basically doing whatever they want. But let's switch gears for a second. You mentioned earlier this journalist, Priscilla Johnson McMillan, who interviewed both Lee and Marina Oswald.
Yeah, her book, Marina and Lee, it's considered a primary source for understanding the Oswalds. But a researcher named John Newman, he's done a lot of digging into the CIA's archives, and he found documents that suggest McMillan's relationship with the CIA was a lot closer than anyone knew.
They were interested in recruiting her, basically.
It seems that way. These documents, they go into detail about the CIA's assessment of her personality, her connections to people who had ties to the Soviet Union, and they even say that they think she could be subtly influenced, encouraged to write articles that would support their agenda.
It's almost like they were trying to turn her into a part of their propaganda machine.
There's even a record of McMillan writing directly to President Kennedy, asking him to help get her notebooks back. The Soviets had confiscated them. That suggests a level of access and influence that most journalists don't have.
So was she working for the CIA knowingly? Or was she unknowingly being used to shape the narrative around the Oswalds?
It's a question that a lot of people have about her work. It makes you think about how blurry the lines can get between journalism, intelligence gathering, and propaganda, especially during really tense political times.
It's just one more layer of complexity in this incredibly complex story. Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one last article I want to talk about. It's called System Maintenance, the UFO Cover-Up and the Permanent Government. And it has a really interesting take on the whole idea of conspiracy theories. This one, it seems a little different from the others, less about hard evidence and more about the bigger picture, like what these theories say about us.
It's definitely more of a philosophical take. It explores this idea that some conspiracy theories, especially the ones about UFOs, they might actually help to, prop up the power structures that they claim to be exposing.
That's a really interesting thought. So these theories, instead of challenging the status quo, they're actually reinforcing it.
That's the argument, yeah. The author says that the whole UFO myth, with all the mystery and the potential for fear, it can distract people from asking hard questions about the people in power. While we're busy arguing about aliens and government cover-ups, we're missing what's happening right here on Earth, the stuff that really affects our lives.
So it's like a smokescreen, right?
Yeah.
While we're all looking up at the sky, wondering about little green men, the real power plays are happening down here, where we can't see them.
Exactly. And the author connects this idea to the JFK assassination, too. They say that all the crazy speculation and misinformation around the case, it might be serving a similar purpose.
So all this information overload, instead of helping us find the truth, it's actually making us more confused and less likely to question things.
That's the argument. We're bombarded with so many different stories, so many unlikely scenarios that we just get overwhelmed and give up on trying to figure out what's real.
That's a scary thought. The idea that the search for truth itself can be used as a tool of control to keep us in the dark.
It definitely makes you think about the importance of critical thinking, being able to evaluate your sources and being skeptical of information that's designed to make you feel something rather than think something.
It sounds like we need to be careful not to get sucked into these rabbit holes without a good map and a compass that actually points north.
Absolutely. We need to be able to separate fact from fiction, evidence from pure speculation.
So where does this leave us? We've gone through a lot in this deep dive. We've talked about the weird inconsistencies in the Tippit case, the technical arguments about the Zapruder film, those conflicting accounts of where Oswald was and what he was doing, the possibility of the CIA being involved, those shadowy operations of LUAC, even the idea that a journalist might have been used to shape the story. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really shows you how complex this whole event is and how much we still don't know. We've seen how witness testimony can be unreliable, how even scientific evidence can be twisted, how powerful institutions might operate in the shadows and maybe even deceive the public, all to protect their own interests.
The assassination of JFK, it's like this open wound in the American consciousness, isn't it?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if some answers will just always be out of reach.
Maybe, but I think even if we never find all the answers, the search itself is important. It's about more than just this one event. It's about how we understand truth and power and how we as citizens engage with those big questions.
That's a great point. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the JFK assassination. We've covered a lot, but like you said, there's always more to explore. Hopefully you're leaving here with more questions than you came with, a little bit of healthy skepticism, and maybe even a renewed sense of curiosity to keep digging for the truth.